Hello. Welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. I'm delighted to welcome both our online and in-person audience to tonight's talk, Heaven on the Hudson, Mansions, Monuments and Marvels of Riverside Park with Stephanie Azzarone. I also want to mention that the book is available for purchase. So this is really the most magnificent book. In addition to providing a fascinating overview of Riverside Park, includes some wonderful photographs by the photographer, Robert Rodriguez, who also happens to be here this evening. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanic Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785, 238 years ago. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various cultural and educational programs. These include our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, and your in-person visitors are welcome to explore the Lock Museum after the lecture. Our library, of course, of which this lecture is taking place this evening. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute. And finally, our lecture series, which I'm pleased to say is we are part of a proud legacy of public programs and lectures that started in 1838. For the online audience, please feel free to submit typed questions throughout the lecture through the Q&A section, and of course, at the conclusion of the talk. For the in-person audience, we do ask that you hold off on your questions until the end of the lecture. Stephanie Azzarone is a native New Yorker who has lived on Riverside Drive most of her adult life. A former journalist, freelancer for the New York Times and New York Magazine, among others, she also ran an award-winning public relations agency. Currently, she is studying for her tour guide certification to share her knowledge of the Upper West Side along the Hudson River with natives and tourists alike. It is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Stephanie Azzarone.
Thank you, Karen. Good evening and welcome, everyone. A little bit of additional background before we begin. As Karen said, I have lived on Riverside Drive across from Riverside Park for many, many years now. And when I wanted to learn more about my own neighborhood, I discovered that while much had been written about Central Park and Fifth Avenue, there were only bits and pieces about Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. And so my goal with Heaven on the Hudson was to bring together the history and the architecture and the people of the neighborhood and tell their story from the point of view of a longtime resident. So to all of you here in the audience in this spectacular space, and to those of you zooming in from home, thank you so much for joining me this evening to share their story. Tonight, I'm going to tell the tale of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive through the eyes and the thoughts and the deeds, and whenever I can, the spectacular mansions of the people responsible for it. Specifically, those who conceived of Park and Drive, promoted them, designed them, and then later redesigned them to make them the Park and Drive that I and so many others love today. Now, importantly, many of those people actually lived in the neighborhood. So for them, this was not just a grand municipal project or a speculative real estate investment. This was their home. They were the pioneers. So let us begin. Riverside Park, the original Riverside Park, extended from 72nd Street to 129th Street along the Grand Hudson River on New York's Upper West Side. Picture, if you would, what life must have been like in the neighborhood 500 and more years ago, in the time of the Native American Lenape, and then in the 1600s, the era of the early Dutch settlers. A high rocky cliff was bordered along the river by deep green forest, undisturbed save for hunting and gathering. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, that scenery had begun to change, largely due to huge land grants by the English, some 150 acres or more per person. To put that into perspective, a football field is roughly equivalent to 1 acre, meaning those early settlers owned about 150 football fields worth of prime real estate where Riverside Park and Riverside Drive stand today. The goal of these grants was to create European settlements where there were none. A few farms arose on the land, followed by a smattering of grand estates, also known as country seats, inhabited by families such as the Delanceys, the Apthorpes, and the Livingstons. That oh so handsome gentleman on the left is Henry Brockhost Livingston, about whom you will hear more later. His family back then was sworn enemies of the family of the gentleman on the right, Oliver Delancey. The Apthorpes, meanwhile, lived just down the road. In the 1800s, what we know as the Upper West Side, especially close to the Hudson River, became that century's version of the Hamptons. A beautiful waterside escape for the wealthy, filled with lavish homes. As one promotional brochure for the development of Riverside put it ever so dreamily, in the olden time when this region between the Central Park and Riverside Park was occupied with the villas of the wealthy and luxurious New York merchants, it surpassed anything in the land for the elegance of its buildings and the beauty of its landscaped gardening. The photo here is of the William Ponsonby furnace home, either built in the 1830s, 1840s, or acquired at that time from Apthorpe descendant, and later much expanded. Furness was an American who made his fortune in the shipping business. He lived most of the year downtown, but each spring traveled with his wife and 6 children to his uptown estate. Now, when Furness died in 1871, his Riverside Drive estate was valued at about $1 million, or roughly 23 million in today's currency. After their parents passed away, the Furness siblings rented out their childhood home, advertising it in 1871 as a country house and grounds, Riverview, stable, gardener's lodge with 5 rooms, garden and fruit trees, house containing 16 rooms, bathroom, oven and kitchen range with hot and cold water, stationary tubs, oilcloth, etc. Also to let, 6 acres or less adjoining. It was said of the mansion's early days, the lawn sloped to the water's edge. Here were heard the merry shouts of romping children who loved the house as their birthplace and played in the lush grass and blossoming rose with the freedom of country life, or bathed or floated, feeling a sense of proprietorship of the river that was then only dotted with occasional sails and formed a gentle boundary to their parental domain. Doesn't that sound wonderful? And so the lovely, peaceful, and bucolic area remained until 1846, when the Hudson River Railroad, later the New York Central Railroad, slashed through those dense virgin woods that had been home to hunters to lay tracks along the waterfront, allowing freight trains to run between New York City and Albany. But the history of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive is as much a history of people as it is of events. And today, I'd like to share the stories of those who had the most impact on the area's development, the men I like to call the leading social influencers of their time. Some of their names you will know. Others have been lost to time. For tonight, let's bring them back. Before that, though, let me point out here that developing the Upper West Side as a whole had its challenges. There were rocky outcroppings everywhere, time-consuming and expensive to blast away. There was an insane asylum where Columbia University is today, and no one wanted to be near what they termed the local maniacs. Squatters populated the area. For a long time, there was no public transportation from the Upper West Side to the downtown business district, but there were freight trains, dirty, noisy freight trains, but more on them later. So what I'd like to do is talk about the folks who made and then remade the park. Specifically, Cyrus Clark, Egbert VL or Vili or VLA, I've heard it pronounced all those ways, William R. Martin, Andrew Housewell Green, Frederick Law Olmsted, Calvert Fox, and then afterward, one person one power broker, I should say, who redesigned it. And let us begin with Cyrus Clark. Cyrus Clark was once well known as the father of the West Side. He was so called for his role as a premier champion of the area, as well as one of its major investors. Keep in mind here that the men who fought most forcibly to develop Riverside Park and Riverside Drive also happened to be those who would make the most money if this succeeded. Nothing new there. Clark lobbied for neighborhood improvements such as mass transit, street lamps, and sewer and water lines, and specifically for the development of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. He was for many years president of the West End Association, previously called the West Side Association. It was formed by leading businessmen to promote public improvements north of 59th Street and west of Central Park, thereby bettering both quality of life and the value of their property investments. You'll hear the West End Association referred to frequently this evening. Also note that what we now call the West Side was early on more often referred to as the West End. Now, Clark had built a significant personal fortune in the wholesale silk business, and clearly a man with foresight, later studied real estate development. In 1866, Clark purchased the house and extensive property of Henry Brockhouse Livingston, the distinctive looking gentleman a few sides back. Now that house, known as Oak Villa, was built before 1811 near what is now 90th Street and Riverside Drive. After the park opened, Clark commissioned a new house, seen here, also on 90th Street, but directly across the street from the old one. It was faced with rough cut granite and had a marvelous red tile roof, distinguished, as you can see, by a delightful array of chimneys and dormers and two wonderful spiky towers. And it was surrounded by porches that were the ideal setting for the area's stunning views of the river and beyond. At the time, it cost the outlandish sum of $90,000. Now, what did the Clarks see from those ivy-covered porches? Steamships and sailboats, ferries and small fishing boats, tugboats too. After Clark's death, a sculptural bronze relief memorial was created in his honor and embedded in a rock outcropping near the 83rd Street entrance to Riverside Park, where, if you look carefully, it may still be seen today. Next, Egbert Ludovicus VL. Aside from possessing a delicious middle name, VL, like his neighbor Cyrus Clark, played an important role in the development of the Upper West Side. Also like Clark, VL was a key member of the West End Association advocacy group. He actively promoted mass transit for the area and was an outspoken proponent of Riverside Park. What we would today call a true multi-hyphenate, VL was a West Point graduate, Army Brigadier General, surveyor, U.S. representative from New York, one of the first sanitary engineers in the country, and engineer-in-chief of Central Park. Interestingly, he also submitted a design for Central Park, but lost that competition to Frederick Law Olmsted, about whom you will hear more in a few minutes. Now, VL was responsible for the VL map, published in the 1860s and celebrated as a great cartographic masterpiece. The map shows New York City's waterways, canals, swamps, rivers, ponds, and more, superimposed over the street grid. It has been referenced during the construction of some of the city's most famous buildings, including the Empire State Building and World Trade Center. Viel maintained that as the city paved over bodies of water and leveled out natural drainage channels on its march uptown, underground waterways would stagnate, leading to yellow fever, malaria, and even plague. As a result, he campaigned vigorously for an effective sewer and sanitation system, becoming a key lobbyist for the Metropolitan Health Law of 1866. Notably, this was the first New York state legislation for the comprehensive control of sanitary conditions in the cities. Most importantly for our story, the bill's requirements applied when it came to clearing out the disease-breeding waters of the Upper West Side, contributing greatly to the region's development. Throughout the 1870s, sewers and water mains were built in the area. Also like Clark, Viel was an enthusiastic believer in the area's worth and future. He wrote, "This entire region combines in its general aspect all that is magnificent in the leading capitals of Europe. In our Riverside Avenue, the equivalent of the Chiaia of Naples and the Corso of Rome." I love the drama. There was a lot of this, a great deal of hyperbole and over-the-top enthusiasm, both by individuals and by the media, when it came to the likely future of the area. Viel anticipated that the Upper West Side would become home to what he termed a higher order of domestic architecture than it has been the good fortune of New York heretofore to possess, and maintained that it would evolve into one of Manhattan's most desirable residential districts. On the personal side, in 1872, Viel built a red brick, ivy-colored villa for his family on what would later be Riverside Drive. As you can see, perfectly rounded windows embellished the tallest of the home's many towers. The mansion faced south with a broad veranda extending around the southwest and east sides. Look closely at this picture and you will see the man himself standing on the steps of his estate. Now, while extremely confident about the area's future, Viel was less so about his own. He harbored a fear of being buried alive, which apparently, according to at least one source, was an unfortunate but surprisingly common problem in the 19th century. And upon his death in 1902, he had a buzzer installed in his pyramid-shaped mausoleum at West Point, right there, which, if pressed by him, would alert someone in the cemetery office. I am happy to share with you that there is no record of it having been put into service. William R. Martin. Now, Martin was a man with a mission and great skill in marketing that mission. At the time, Martin, a lawyer and real estate speculator, was a parks commissioner, as well as president of, you guessed it, the West End Association. This, and 15 years before Riverside Drive and Riverside Park became a reality, he published a pamphlet called The Growth of New York that proposed changing 12th Avenue into a combined scenic carriage drive and park along the Hudson River. Riverside Avenue, as Riverside Park was initially called, was conceived as an elegant and expansive boulevard lined with trees overlooking the park and the waterfront and bordered by imposing mansions. Martin envisioned this future development as forming the city's preeminent residential street, expected to eclipse Fifth Avenue with ease. This vision of Riverside Drive as the new Fifth Avenue is the key theme throughout the early development of Park and Drive. In his pamphlet, Martin imagined a time when West Side residents could come out of a summer afternoon upon the Riverside Park and through its drives and walks among its flowers, under the cool shade of its old trees, in its casinos or small buildings and refreshment houses, could have in the city all the enjoyment of the millionaire in his $100,000 villa at Irvington, the village on the Hudson River in Westchester County. Now I ask you, what investor or homeowner in his right mind could resist a description like that? Other enterprising gentlemen of the era quickly shared their own romantic visions for the city. Quoting here, the 8th Avenue, it was predicted, on the west flank of the park, in other words, Central Park West, would become a street of millionaires' mansions, outdoing even 5th Avenue in spectacle and grandeur. West End Avenue, it was asserted, would one day become a magnificent shopping street, and an even grander future was predicted for Riverside Drive. Andrew Haswell Green. The next step toward fulfilling this ecstatic real estate reverie that was going on occurred the year after Martin's pamphlet, when Andrew Haswell Green introduced an act to the New York State Legislature for the development of a park and drive along the Hudson River. A lawyer, civic leader, and the giant of 19th century city planning, Green is considered the father of Greater New York, a name given to him by President Theodore Roosevelt for Green's leadership role in consolidating the city's boroughs, making New York at the time the second largest city in the world, next to London. Cyrus Clark, remember, was simply the father of the West Side. Green also served as president of the Board of Education and as the city controller. For 13 years, he was active in or led the Central Park Commission. Green was a key driver behind major New York City sites, including Central Park, the New York Public Library, the New York Zoological Society and Botanical Gardens, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. No slouch. The act Green presented to the legislature and became law in 1867, empowering the Central Park Commissioners to acquire land above 72nd Street between the Heights and the railroad tracks for Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. This was, so to speak, the green light. The land was then purchased in several stages, with the first portion secured through eminent domain in 1872. Now, here comes the juicy part. It was not until many years after all of this that Cornelius M. Williams either mistook Green for a man who was having an affair with Williams' lover, or, depending on the account, thought Green was protecting a woman who had spread fake news about Williams. In any case, Williams shot Green 5 times right in front of Green's home in the middle of the afternoon, killing him. And here's a photo of the funeral. In honor of Green's contribution to the city, the flags of City Hall were lowered to half-mast. In his Encyclopedia of New York City, architectural historian Kenneth T. Jackson called Green arguably the most important leader in Gotham's long history, more important than Peter Stuyvesant, Alexander Hamilton, Frederick Law Olmsted, Robert Moses, and Fiorello LaGuardia, which I think you'll agree is saying something. With the land now ready for park and residential development, it was crucial to find a fitting design for what was to be an entirely new community, one meant to attract the city's foremost families. Again, everyone is thinking Fifth Avenue West Side version. The park commissioners turned to none other than Frederick Law Olmsted to design Riverside Drive and Riverside Park, the upper and lower levels, respectively, of this extensive and exciting new undertaking. To answer a question that I had before beginning Heaven on the Hudson, and which you may have as well, yes, the park and drive were both part of the same project, undertaken and opened, but not completed, the same year. We've talked about the men who most influenced the development of Park and Drive. Now let's look at the man who designed them, or at least the original version of them. I'm sure everyone in this meeting knows the name of Frederick Law Olmsted and that he designed Central Park. But did you know that he also designed Riverside Park and Riverside Drive? That, in fact, is rarely mentioned in the summaries of his work. Olmsted was the principal landscape architect of his time and a leading pioneer of that profession. But this field wasn't his first choice. For many years, Olmsted pursued a most varied career as a journalist and author. He traveled throughout the American South and Texas for the New York Daily Times, now the New York Times. Beyond that, Olmsted served as executive secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission, a precursor to the Red Cross. He took part in the organization of the Southern Famine Relief Commission after the Civil War, and later helped create the New York State Charities Aid Association, where he served as vice president for many years. Olmsted was also active in the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History. In 1857, he was named Central Park Superintendent. And as if all of that were not enough, in 1872, he was nominated for Vice President of the United States by a splinter group of liberal Republicans. Although flattered, Olmsted withdrew his name from consideration. Olmsted had a background in both engineering and farming, as well as a belief that exposure to nature by all classes was important to the health of society. At a time when so-called parks were most likely to be within private estates or, like Riverside Park, locked behind gates to which only the wealthy had keys, this was a novel concept. Along with being a man of extraordinary achievements, Olmsted was also said to be of a very kind disposition. According to his obituary, it is related of him that he once remodeled his plans for extensive private grounds when it was found that they would interfere with a mother watching her children at play, and changed them entirely so that the mother might not lose the pleasant vista. Apocryphal as that may or may not be, it's still a wonderful story. He also married his brother's widow and adopted their 3 children. When Olmsted was 73 years old, the famous artist John Singer Sargent painted this portrait of him, leaning on his cane against a bucolic scene of flowers and trees. We have over 100 illustrations in Heaven on the Hudson, and this is actually one of my favorite. Olmsted was commissioned for the Riverside project in 1873 and submitted a preliminary plan that year and a final plan 2 years later, designed to develop Riverside Park and Riverside Drive together. And here is that plan, with Olmsted's signature in the lower right-hand corner and the date 1875. Olmsted's proposal for Park and Drive featured a design to fit the area's hilly, rocky topography. A different, less inspired plan presented before his involvement pictured a straight drive 100 feet wide that followed the city's street grid rather than the shifting contours of the cliffs. Carrying out this first approach would have required extensive leveling and regrading and the construction of a retaining wall far too high to allow practical access to the park. Discontent with what was called an unimaginative and impractical scheme led to Olmsted's hiring. I suspect that the fact that Olmsted's design would also cost less than the original plan, because it required a lower retaining wall and less landfill, likely did not escape the city's notice. In Olmsted's vision, the park's eastern border would follow the area's undulating pattern of nature. He wrote that the location presented great advantages as a park because the riverbank had been for a century occupied as the lawns and ornamental gardens in front of the country seats along its banks, which you saw some slides back. Its foliage was fine and its views magnificent. He incorporated those gardens and that foliage into his design. According to the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, Olmsted, quote, combined the land purchased for the avenue and that purchased for the park. He considered the existing grades and contours, the existing plantings and views, and designed a winding drive that would be comfortable for horses and pleasure driving, provide shaded walks for pedestrians, and yet would give easy access to real estate bordering it on the east. Olmsted considered this location ideal for hosting the city's main promenade for drivers, riders, and walkers alike, and designed it to be long and wide enough to accommodate different types of traffic and activities. As you can see here, plans for Riverside Drive, which would parallel the park and river, included a tree-lined pedestrian walkway, a lane for horseback riding, and 2 broad lanes for carriages, with a median separating northbound traffic from south. Olmsted's proposal stated, part of the main highway, specifically that portion between 104th and 123rd Streets, was to be arranged as a public promenade to command views over the Hudson and to be shaded in all its parts. North of 123rd Street, the park and the drive were to be arranged to allow a resting and turning place for carriages, from which the view up the river was to be kept as open as possible. Finally, by early 1877, work began on Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. At that time, the largest and most ambitious municipal road building project ever undertaken in New York. Now is the time to note one very important historical fact. Olmsted's Riverside Park ended at the railroad tracks. It was park, train track, Hudson River, and nothing in between. As was typical for the era, the vacant land to the west of the tracks would be developed with commercial docks to serve the shipping companies that plied their trade along the Hudson River. Also keep in mind that the commercial use of land bordering the river would be a major point of contention for years to come. Also notable is that although he was responsible for the sweep and swerve of Riverside Drive, Olmsted's work did not, in the end, extend to the park's interior. In 1878, 2 years before Riverside Park's official opening, Olmsted was removed as park superintendent because of Tammany Hall politics. Put another way, Boss Tweed fired the god of landscape architecture. Some years later, William R. Martin, remember it was Martin who enthusiastically promoted the whole Riverside Park, Riverside Drive idea, wrote Olmsted asking if he, Olmsted, would consider further consultation on Riverside Park. Olmsted would not, writing, quoting him here, "I don't want to bother with New York politics and will not move a finger to secure any engagement with the department," meaning the park department, "nor have anyone else do so in my behalf." That's telling him. In any case, over the next few decades post-Olmsted, there was no comprehensive plan for the design of the park's interior, nor was Olmsted's original concept for it fully followed. Instead, the interior was developed by a series of designers employed by the Parks Department, including Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's old business partner and of course partner in Central Park. Vaux was appointed superintending architect of the Department of Public Parks in 1881 and was likely responsible for laying out the park's first set of paths. But apparently, no one really knows what Vaux's role was in Riverside Park. It seems that Olmsted had a much better publicist. All that said, Riverside Park and Riverside Drive opened in 1880, but not without drama. The park itself debuted in March of that year, but the drive was delayed until May. And why? Throughout the Riverside project, there were disputes with the contractors about money and deadlines and materials. In spring of 1880, this came to a head. In response, the builders barricaded all the existing cross streets with piles of stone, derricks, kind of crane, and heavy timbers, and posted guards to arrest anyone who attempted to trespass, effectively cutting off Riverside Drive access to property owners. This did not go over well. Sometime past midnight on May 7th, 100 or so individuals picked up what stood in their way and hurled it over the retaining wall into the park below. As a result, and I'm quoting here again, the sun rose on Riverside Avenue, opened for the first time from one end to the other. The citizens along the avenue were jubilant, and all of them conveniently ignorant as to the man under whose orders the barriers had been destroyed. Once they were opened, Park and Drive alike were a huge success, especially among equestrians and later bicyclists. Photos show the drive bustling with open carriages and strollers and 19th century finery. Studebaker, a carriage manufacturer before it began producing automobiles, ran advertisements featuring a well-heeled lady enjoying a carriage ride down the avenue. The day's equestrians frequently rode to the north end of Central Park, then up 7th Avenue and back down along Riverside Park. Throughout the mid to late 1890s, when cycling in the city drew thousands of riders and spectators alike, the drive was New York's most popular setting. Harper's Weekly called it the paradise of bicyclists. The New York Times declared, "The Sunday procession of cyclists has got to be one of the sights of the city." On any given day, carriage drivers, behatted equestrians, and carefully balanced cyclists would compete for space and the opportunity both to enjoy the view, and be part of it. Park and Drive eventually attracted homeowners who created amazing residences. As of the mid-1880s, about a dozen large freestanding homes known as villas bordered the park on the drive, and by the 1890s, construction was in full swing. Keep in mind that these were not the row houses that remain on the drive today. The villas filled far more than a single lot. At least one of them and its garden took up an entire square block. One of my favorite houses, and one of only two freestanding villas extant today. And it is the only privately owned of the two, is this one, the Shanazi Mansion, which looks much the same now as it did when it was built in 1909. It belonged to Morris Shanazi, a tobacco baron who began his professional life as a cemetery guard. This bright white limestone confection encompasses 12,000 square feet and what was originally 35 rooms, and is chock full of shining marble and glistening mosaics and carved wood. It is glorious. I confess to spending a lot of time standing across the street from it and staring up. The families that moved to Riverside Drive early on were well off, but in most cases, not all, more upper or upper middle class entrepreneurs, bankers, and professionals than robber baron level wealthy. Why? Because despite the glories of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, the clean air, the excellent sanitation, the views, and more, the really rich, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, and the rest had no interest in moving. They were more than content to stay with their own kind, where the women could easily visit each other and drop off their cards or shop local stores, and the men could gather at their local clubs. They didn't need more. From their point of view, they already had everything. Why travel all the way across town and uptown when they already had their water view in Newport? Sadly, starting in the early decades of the 20th century, Riverside Park began to slip into a major state of decline. What happened? The railroad's ever-increasing dominance of the park and the general neglect of what made this space special. From the early days of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, the railroad had fronted the senses of those who lived on the avenue and those who, as a result, determined never to do so. Today, a passing train's whistle, low whistle from within the tunnel, followed by a deep guttural chug, is to me a soothing sound. But back then, the endless clattering of wheels over open air tracks grated on the nerves. All the while, passing steam engines spewed smoke upward to the drive and its residents, accompanied by the sense of livestock being transported to the downtown butcheries and of the garbage dumps lining the tracks. As you might imagine, summertime, when windows were thrown open for cool breezes from the river, presented a particular challenge to residents' olfactory glands. In addition, during the Depression of the 1930s, the dispossessed had set up living quarters alongside the tracks and river. As of April 1934, there were 52 structures known as veterans shacks within the 7 blocks between 72nd and 79th Streets alone. At the same time, the railroad continued to block access to the waterfront, except for commercial purposes, separating the community from the river with barbed wire fences, as you can see in this photo. So, despite its vital role in commerce, the railroad increasingly came to be viewed as a nuisance rather than an essential and inevitable part of the park. There were multiple efforts from the 1870s on by community organizations and the city alike to force the railroad to clean up its act. Finally, to the delight of many, in 1913, the New York State Legislature pressured the railroad into developing a plan to enclose the tracks in a tunnel that could support a park or an esplanade from West 72nd Street to West 123rd Street. Finally, progress. Yet, it was more than a decade later before change began to happen. In 1924, the passage of the Kaufman Act mandated that all trains in New York City run on electric power rather than steam. Electric powered trains were not possible at grade level, primarily for safety reasons. Around that time, meanwhile, the automobile began to dominate as a form of transportation. 1/3 of New York City residents had cars. Traffic choked the city streets, and there was interest among officials in creating a highway along the western end of Manhattan to decrease congestion and provide a rapid route to and from the city, as well as an opportunity for scenic pleasure driving. Also in 1924, Charles Craig, the city's controller, proposed a plan for a parkway near the Hudson to alleviate traffic on local streets. The idea was to use a landfill to extend the park past the railroad tracks and include an esplanade along the waterfront, as well as a roadway, in this case, on top of an enclosed railway. The project also would involve landscaping the new land, restoring the existing park, and providing playgrounds and athletic facilities. Craig's plan was the first of 4 recommendations for Riverside Park's reconstruction proposed in the 1920s alone, not a single one of which was implemented that decade. One problem was that while there was overall support for a parkway, there was no consensus on where exactly it should go. Some, like Craig, suggested building the parkway above the proposed railroad tunnel, which would have brought the sounds of passing cars much closer to the residents of Riverside Drive than they are now. And frankly, as a Riverside Drive resident, I'm really glad that one did not succeed. Others preferred converting the top of the tunnel into parkland and building a waterfront parkway instead. Various civic organizations weighed in over time. The City Club endorsed building the parkway on the waterfront to give more space for recreational uses. At the time, however, the waterfront parkway proposal had little support, and the Board of Estimate voted it down. The Women's League for the Protection of Riverside Park, for example, opposed building the parkway within the park. Leaflets announcing a meeting organized by the League encouraged New Yorkers to save Riverside Park, it belongs to all, and parents, save Riverside Park for your children. Finally, by the late 1920s, the city and New York Central agreed to share the cost of covering the tracks and building what would become the original elevated West Side Highway to 72nd Street. In June 1929, the city approved a plan that would build the parkway above the tracks, not on the waterfront. All was at last good to go. Well, you know what happened. Just 4 months later, In October of that year, boom, the stock market crashed. And plans for the railroad tunnel and highway alike were, you should pardon the expression, stopped in their tracks. While all of this was happening, or rather not happening, Riverside Park itself was suffering from neglect. Water had destroyed some of the existing landfill, forming massive puddles in various spots where it had seeped through. Mud was everywhere, sucking at the heels of those in search of a stroll. Between the railroads and the rain, Riverside Park was a mess. Then came Robert Moses, the man everyone loves to hate. Brilliant, impatient, ruthless, arrogant, powerful, and politically savvy. A believer that his way was the only way. Moses was a man who knew what changes he wanted to make and made sure that no one and nothing, from mayors to money, stood in his way. Moses lived on the Upper West Side much of his life. As a young man, he often visited Riverside Drive, looking out over the park from the high bluffs. In his book, The Power Broker, author Robert Caro writes that what Moses saw in Riverside Park then was a wasteland, nothing but a vast, low-lying mass of dirt and mud. Caro shares a memorable tale about Moses and Riverside Park, which I can't resist retelling. One Sunday in 1914, he was crossing the Hudson by ferry to picnic in New Jersey. As the ferry pulled out into the river, Moses leaned on the rail, watching Manhattan spread out behind the boat, and exclaimed to a fellow passenger, "Isn't this a temptation to you? Couldn't this waterfront be the most beautiful thing in the world?" He described his vision of what it could be like. The ugly tracks hidden by the great highway, cars traveling slowly along it, their occupants enjoying the view, and along the highway, green parks filled with strollers, tennis players, and families on bicycles. There would be sailboats on the river and motor yachts tied up gracefully curving basins. According to Caro, now quoting a fellow ferry passenger, the young Bureau staffer was talking about a public improvement on a scale almost without precedent in turn of the century urban America, an improvement that would solve a problem that had baffled successive city administrators for years. At the age of 25 and years away from a position of power and influence, when it came to Riverside Park, Moses had it all figured out. By the early 1930s, however, Moses had the position and power to realize his vision. In 1934, 2 decades after sharing his concept for Riverside Park on the ferry ride across the Hudson, Moses, by then Parks Commissioner, introduced his West Side Improvement Plan. This enormous undertaking involved covering over the New York Central Railroad tracks and transforming Riverside Park. And that was not all. It also included completing the West Side Elevated Highway, begun in 1927, but then abandoned, constructing the new Henry Hudson Parkway, and then connecting the highway to the parkway at 72nd Street. Accumulating the required city, state, and federal funds in the midst of the Depression required exceptional skill, along with, often enough, a strenuous bending or even breaking of the rules. Moses got the money. The focal point of the Moses expansion was the multi-purpose rotunda here at 79th Street, which not only featured a traffic circle providing an easy entrance to and exit from the Henry Hudson Parkway, but most importantly, thanks to the sunken circular plaza that led to the water, it granted New Yorkers long-awaited access to the river, beyond the few existing narrow footbridges that led to the yacht clubs along the shore. People could finally get to the water's edge without risking life and limb crossing the tracks. The structure's lower levels in Moses's time hosted a fountain and a restaurant with an arcaded terrace overlooking a marina that was designed to be the city's front door for visiting yachts and marine dignitaries. As for the railroad, Moses encased it in a tunnel under the park from 72nd to 123rd Streets, eliminating street level railroad crossings. The top of the tunnel was then allocated to parkland. Remember, Olmsted's Park stopped at the tracks. There was nothing beyond the tracks, not this promenade, none of the playgrounds, none of the recreation facilities that you see today until Moses. To accomplish all of that, changes included filling in the park to the east of the train tunnel to raise the grades to the height of the new railroad roof, flattening sharp slopes, and removing and replacing many of the original stairways, paths, and plantings. Because of the Promethean changes made during the Moses era to accommodate tunnel and parkway, the interior of the park, for the most part, was no longer the vision of Olmsted or the work of the landscape architects that immediately followed him. Instead, it is the master design of Park and Drive together for which Olmsted deserves the greatest recognition today. The sinuous drive adapted to the topography's shifting contours, the islands separating the main and ancillary roadways, and the retaining wall best represent Olmsted's lasting impact on Riverside Park and Riverside Drive when compared to developments in the Moses era. Along with expanding far beyond the tracks, the Moses Park focused on recreation, while the original did not. The 1930s design created a profusion of playgrounds and sports facilities, including basketball, tennis, handball, and volleyball courts, ball fields, and more. Under Moses, it took just 3 years, from 1934 to 1937, for the entire West Side Improvement Plan to be implemented. Can you imagine a project of that size happening with that speed today? In the process, landfill nearly doubled Riverside Park size. There was a man-made promenade within the park for the first time over the tracks enclosed by the tunnel. All of this, covered tracks, playgrounds, recreational facilities, additional park space, was along with the marina, the rotunda, and of course, the completed West Side Highway and new Henry Hudson Parkway. When work was finished, noted one observer, Riverside Park was once again one of the most elegant parks in the city. And so, in my opinion, it remains today. There is more to the story of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, of course. A few decades after Moses, the entire city declined and the park and drive with it. But then its neighbors took up arms, restored it, took care of it, and made it a warm and welcoming place to be once again. But that is a story for another evening. Thank you.
not sure if there are comments or questions from online, so I may start with those before I move to the audience. Where on Riverside Drive was the Veal Mansion?
88th Street.
88th Street,
Mhm.
okay. Where is Clark's Plaque located?
Where's what?
Clark's Plaque?
Oh, that's 83rd Street. Right, as you enter the park, whoops, make a left, and it's on the outcropping there.
And this is a comment from an online viewer actually in Illinois. I live near Riverside in Illinois, and it was also designed by Olmsted. It beautifully follows the contours of the Des Plaines River. Okay, so I really didn't know that Olmsted was also designed outside New York City, but of course it makes complete sense.
He is all over. It's really amazing the number of projects that are Olmsted projects.
Right. I would love to take some in-person questions. There we go.
Thank you. Where did you find the posters? I took a photo of it. Save Riverside Park, meet at Ansonia Hotel.
That's one of my favorites also.
Yeah, I like that one.
I, at this point, don't recall exactly where. Do you remember? Okay, thank you. This is my husband and also the photographer for the book, Robert Rodriguez. And he just reminded me that we found that at the New York Historical Society. Thank you, Robert.
Have we any more questions? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you're thinking about the renovation, restoration of the boat basin. Questions and controversies around that.
Very controversial. So those of you who may not know, the entire boat basin, the marina has been shut down for a good year or more now. It was in bad shape. They are planning to dredge the basin. There will be new docks. There will be additional berths. The docks, which now have wooden pilings, are going to be upgraded to the steel pilings that are basically state of the art. So there's a lot of excellent work that is being planned. However, I know there have been some concerns, certainly by all the people who had to leave, who had their boats docked at the marina and were told to depart while the work was going on. And I know some folks are not appreciative of the new designs for the boathouse there. So while not everyone will agree with exactly what is being done, it was really essential to do work in the basin.
Could you perhaps tell us how many active railroad lines there are underneath the current park?
It's just Amtrak.
And are they the same as they were during the Moses era or not?
No. So the tunnel was shut down in 1980, and that's when freight traffic ended. And in 1991, it was acquired by Amtrak. So now it's just, from my understanding, the Amtrak passenger trains going from Penn Station north.
In terms of the boat, the dock, I was just looking at the West Side RAG, and it talked about the fact that FEMA is involved in terms of, the height of the marina, and they wanted to originally it was a 1-story, and then they decided to make it a 2-story. So I think that's in the debate right now with the agency, as I recall reading the RAG. So,
Yeah, there are lots of people who are concerned about that.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take an online question. Can you tell us a little bit about the North Park? Are you describing this portion in your book as well? He's specific, 135th Street and above, and that's from Jared.
Thank you. The focus of the book is actually the original park. which goes up to 129th Street. I do have a chapter in the book that addresses in small part the northern part of the park. The book does recognize that over time, the bulk of attention has been paid to the lower portions of the park, but now people are aware that that was neglectful and more is being done in northern park. But the bulk of the book is on the original part of the park.
Thank you for your really marvelous research. Question about the funding for this project. Was this all from New York? Was it private? Any private funding?
For which part of this, please?
The entire Riverside Park.
Okay, so the old.
And approximate cost and current dollars.
I'm laughing because the real costs and the cost that Moses said were entirely different. So the way back, the initial cost of acquiring land for the park was $6 million. And at some point that with additional purchases, that went up to $7.5 million. With the Moses project, so Moses projected that it would cost $11 million. And when it was all finished, he said it did cost $24 million. But in actuality, according to the New York Times and also to the power broker, no one really knows how much the whole West Side Improvement Plan and the park cost. And those sources are estimated the actual cost not at 24 million, but somewhere between 150 and 200 plus million. Yes, that was Moses.
Is that in terms of today's dollars or when it was actually?
No, I think
done?
that was today's dollars. Yes.
Stephanie, I found it interesting that you're both married, right? You just divulged that wonderful details. So just where are you and Robert New Yorkers? And how long did it take to write the book? And were you equally as interested in writing the book? Like, did you encourage each other? Did you sometimes fight? What happened?
So we didn't show you the divorce papers. It took about 2 years to write the book. We worked on it as a team. And yes, there were some concerns, I think, when we started as to whether we would make it through and still like each other. But I think it's fair to say that we're still a team. Actually, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary next month. So, so yeah, it worked out well. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, and we are native New Yorkers. Yeah. I grew up in Queens, in Astoria. If there are any Queens folks out there, and my husband grew up in Brooklyn.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to thank you very much. This has been absolutely fascinating. And you had indicated that there were still 2 freestanding villas. Can you let us know where they are?
Yes, the one in the photograph, which is the privately owned one, the Shinazi Mansion, that is on the northeast corner of 107th Street. And the other one is actually a yeshiva now, Yeshiva Katana, and that is on the southeast corner of 89th Street. You should go look, they're gorgeous.
That's a wonderful book. I've enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Almost finished. Great presentation. There's a building at, I think, 97th or 98th Street, and it's not actually on Riverside Drive. It's just a little bit back. It has very interesting Aztec motifs on the outside.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that,
It is a
please?
fabulous building. I'm glad you asked about that. I love that building. I stop and stare at it every time I walk by. It's the Cliff Dweller, and it is what's called Native American, Mesoamerican styling to it. The architect is Herman Meeder, and it's got raised brick in geometric patterns, and it has all sorts of masks and corn and all kinds of Native American symbols and figures throughout. And it's just fascinating. It's arts and crafts in style. And it's unlike anything else on the drive. It's actually on Riverside Drive. Yeah. That was the architect's style. And actually, it's also interesting. Yeah, well, yeah, that's the other part of it. The southern end is very narrow. It's only 9 feet wide on the southern end because of the shape of the lot. So the shape of the building is that way because of the lot size, but the design was the architect's preference.
Right, I'm going to take out just a few online questions, and then I'm just going to take a final remainder, couple of questions from the in-person audience. When was this is from Antoinette online? When was the Riverside Church built, and was Grant's tomb already in the area when Riverside Park Drive opened up in that area?
Okay, Riverside Church was built, I believe the date was 1931 when it was finished. Grant's tomb was built, no, yes, the park was there before Grant's tomb. The park was built in 1880, completed in 1880, and Grant's tomb was built 1897.
Right. This is from Tom. A very good talk. Thank you. Where is the Sergeant portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted?
It's at the Biltmore. It's at the Biltmore.
Right.
In North Carolina.
Right, so
Yeah.
not readily available for many of us in
No,
this audience to
unfortunately.
see. Right, okay, right. I'm going to go to a couple of people.
Thanks. This is a question about the cover of your book on the screen. I can't place this, looks like a 1920s apartment building with 2 towers. Where is that?
Oh, yes, thank you. I had to put my glasses on too. That is the Normandy, the one on the
Oh, the
lower picture, the
Normandy.
Normandy, yeah.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Over here, and then I'm going to take that gentleman, and then I think you can probably ask Stephanie questions informally when she's signing a book, her book.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I've lived on Riverside Drive for 35 years.
Oh, wonderful.
I wanted to say, I'm editor of The Nation, and Frederick Law Olmsted wrote the
Yes.
founding manifesto for the nation in
Yes.
1863 and was one of the key founders.
Yes, I know.
which we
That's wonderful.
cherish. It's an observation.
Thank you. No, thank you for mentioning that, for adding that. He was very multi-talented.
Yes, and in fact, we had a comment from a member of the online audience that Eric Larson's Devil in the White City also tells the story of Olmsted's work designing the landscaping of Chicago's World Fair in 1893. He certainly got about.
Yes, he did.
Can you comment on the role of the Riverside Park Conservancy in terms of its current impact on our life?
Well, they have a lot of plans. I think the Conservancy is terrific. I think they've done a wonderful job of taking care of the park. They have a new president as of the past year or so. I know she has a very ambitious agenda, and I'm eager to see how that plays out. And of course, I'm very excited that they just received funding for the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. So that's been falling apart for some time now, and it's been barricaded. And so I'm looking forward to the restoration of that sometime in the near future.
Stephanie, thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
absolutely
Thank you, everyone.
fantastic. And no, Stephanie, would you stay with us? Again, I mean your vast knowledge that you've gained in your beautiful, eloquent way of describing the development of the park. And I do want to mention in the book as well, in addition to covering so comprehensively the history, you will also find more on the personalities in the buildings. Would that be a correct description,
Yes,
Stephanie?
yes, there's a lot about the individual buildings and people who live there.
Right. So as I have just mentioned, I'm going to remind you again, our online audience can purchase this through Fordham University Press website. And of course, we have a bookseller here tonight who will also be selling this really wonderful book. And I'm sure that Stephanie will be happy to autograph the book for you. Thank you. Right. So, but finally, I'm just going to ask our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle, to say a few words.
And I'll just be brief. I want everyone to go and buy your book. Stephanie and Robert, thank you. I'm a native New Yorker too. I grew up in Inwood. And when you showed the picture of the park, I mean, it was just the greatest place to grow up and be in Inwood Hill Park. And this book is a gift to all of New York. And that you bring these stories, these important stories to life in the best of ways. And I just wish, you know, that more people, when they live in a greater place as New York, would sometimes really think about the history and all that came before. I mean, I know that when I'm in Central Park, there's not a time that I don't think about the architects in Central Park and the idea that they conceived of this, and we're blessed for generation after generation. So thank you for your work in adding to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So finally, I just want to remind you, this is one of many lectures that are upcoming, and this might be of particular interest to the audience here tonight, The Magnificent Bridges of New York City with Dave Frider. And in fact, that's next Tuesday, April 25th at 6 p.m. So again, I hope our in-person audience might join us for a glass of wine while they purchase a book. And finally, I would like to express our huge appreciation to Stephanie. And hopefully Stephanie will be back because she and her husband are also collaborating on a book on the fountains of New York City. So see you in a couple of years.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. And thank you to our online audience. Thank you.